Have you ever wondered what home means to you? Is it where you are, where you've been, or where you're going? Our guest today has a unique answer to this question. He's grown up exploring the concept of home through the power of storytelling. Erick Galindo, a red-headed Mexican-American originally from Compton, grew up a misfit and somehow found his true calling. He's now the guy that gets to tell stories about misfits. Erick survived incredible odds to become an award-winning writer, creator, director, podcast host, and showrunner. Today, we have a multi-layered discussion about the complex concept of home, cultural identity, heritage, and personal evolution. You're listening to My Most Authentic Life, where we explore big changes and unconventional journeys. My name is Fede Vargas. I pivoted from a successful sales career, inspiring others considering a pivot. So let's get to it. So honored that you're on the podcast, Erick. I've been a big fan of your work, recent fan of your work. And the more I get to know about it, the more I'm reflecting personally on my own journey as a Mexican growing up in Canada. And I can't wait to start unpacking your story today. Thank you for being on the podcast.
I'm very happy to be here. Honored to be here virtually from Los Angeles to Canada. Pretty dope. Mexicans in Canada. I love it.
And how this interview came about was because I was listening to your podcast, Out of the Shadows. That year, 1986, amnesty year that you cover in your podcast is the same year that I arrived in Canada, that my family arrived in Canada under much different circumstances than Mexicans in 1986 in the US. But let's start there with the year 1986 and what that means for you.
In 1986, the Reagan administration, Congress was, I would say, a Democratic Senate and a Republican House, or vice versa. But it was a split Congress in the United States. Both parties came together, created a bill that granted amnesty to millions of families in the United States who had been living in the shadows, undocumented for, decades in some cases. And it was signed by President Ronald Reagan and made into law. And that allowed my parents, who were both undocumented, to get green cards, get jobs where they were respected and could earn a decent living, and eventually buy a house, a home. And so that year was a game changer in many ways for many communities, but it's very personal to me because it really changed the trajectory of my life. I was born in the US, but I was the only one in my family at the time born here. So I was in a mixed status family, which can be very traumatic, both for the people who don't have a status and for the people who have a status. So it was definitely a remarkable shift in my life. And so the series Out of the Shadows aims to tackle the US's complicated history with immigration. And the first two seasons are currently out now, wherever you get your podcast. And that's my plug.
Yeah, there you go. And it's a wonderful podcast. I've been listening to it, talking about the pandemic experience for you from looking at your work. It was transformative. And one of the things that you referred to is this idea of home, right? And what home means to you. And you asked the question of, is it where you live? Is it where you want to be? And I think that kind of internal debate are good moments to have to look inward and answer that question for ourselves. So tell us what home means to you.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, I think when I started the pandemic, that was like the first big question for me because we were shelter at home, working from home, stay home, don't go out unless you have to. And I was just like, what is home? Because home has a very layered meaning for me. And Wild and one of my other podcasts, I really get into it over the course of 10 episodes. But I think It's like this idea of, is it where you are? Is it where you've been? Is it where you want to be?
I love that.
And I think for me, it's all three existing in harmony together, because if you only think about home as where you are, then you're not really thinking about the bigger, broader community, the bigger picture, right? If you think about where you want to be, I think that helps you with that. So if I'm like, my house is nice, I have a really nice house, but my neighborhood is shitty, you know, or my city is bad, or my country is awful, or the world is chaotic, right? Then, and I don't care about that, then I think that I'm fucking up. Now, if I have a really nice home and the world is terrible and I don't appreciate my home because the world is terrible, I'm also fucking up.
Absolutely.
You know, so I think they have to live in harmony, like where I want to be, where I am, and where I've been, all to me represent like a full totality of home.
I love how you explained that. It's an intersection where things are in harmony.
I think so too. Yeah, like you live in Canada, you've lived in Mexico.
Yeah.
How do you see home?
Yeah. See, for me, the most simple definition is where things feel aligned.
I love that.
And that kind of aligns with your answer too, because when are things aligned, right? When people you care about are around, when you feel comfortable with your surroundings, where the food tastes good, that's when you're aligned, right? That's when you feel alive. So whenever I have those feelings, you just know you feel like home. But to your point, for me, it could be in Mexico. It was definitely in Mexico when I was there for 2 years, but it's also being back in Canada and reclaiming my story here.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that sometimes we have to leave home, like to come back and not only appreciate what we experienced, but also make it our own,
Yeah.
like you're doing right now.
So, talking about home, and another of the things that you speak about is in Out of the Shadows is building a house on a shaky foundation, right? Some of our histories when we were displaced as kids and had to go to a new country to build a new reality, it feels like our foundation is a bit shaky, right? So, how do we move forward? Does the home have to be demolished, or do we do some patchwork renovations and build a new chapter? How do we move forward when the foundation is shaky?
I would say if we're talking to an architect or an engineer, they're going to tell us, like, I think you got to tear this thing down, start over. But I think that reality is much more nuanced than like a sort of binary dichotomy, right? And
Yep.
I think it's going to be like a case by case basis. I think the question of displacement is a very interesting one. You know, like the other day I was listening to the radio here in LA, and I was listening to this radio show called Brown Bag, and one of the hosts, Letty, on the show, brought up this idea that she thinks about a lot, which is she probably wouldn't be here if the Spanish wouldn't have landed in Latin America and did a lot of terrible things and displaced a lot of people. And so she wonders, a lot about whether she should be upset that they did that or be thankful and grateful. And I think that for people who've had similar types of experiences, I think that's that weird space that we have to live in. And it's again not fair. It sucks that some people are like, yeah, we came over on the Mayflower and we've been, we're the daughters of the American Revolution and shit, and we have societies, and it's like being here, like we chose to come, for. And then there's the rest of us who, we were thrust into this place, and I think that we have to find, like what you were talking about, that alignment, right? I think for some people it is tear that shit down, and some people do. And, I will say for my parents who were in a very violent part of Mexico, the foundation was very shaky and they tore that down and they came to the United States and started building on a different kind of shaky foundation. But I think in this case, they chose patchwork, and were able to build, you know, a beautiful home for their offspring, so that we are starting on a more solid foundation. And I think that for me, all I want to do is sort of help improve the foundation so that the next generation has a even better foundation, And I think that, again, sometimes you just got to tear that shit down, And I don't know when those choices have to be made. I'm not, thankfully, somebody that has to make those choices. But for me, I think right now it is about transforming, the environment instead of letting the environment transform me.
Yeah, it's an abstract question. I think it's a very individual answer based on your history.
For sure.
I think I've attempted both, but if you go the demolition route, you always realize that, oh, damn, I forgot that little part to demolish.
That's true.
It was hidden away.
I was trying to delete photos off your phone. They're actually in the trash can. Oh, I know the trash can is actually, you can't really delete them. Yeah. I think that's true. I think you got to face it. Sometimes you want to ignore it or run away from it or tear it all down. But I think unless you face it, you're not going to be able to transform it. And so hopefully my parents, they left their home to build a new home with a better future for themselves. But I think it wasn't until maybe they were, well into their life experience here in the United States that they were able to face that karma, and transform it. And instead of being the kind of people that run away, they became the kind of people that fought for what they love. And I think that we all we get to that precipice. And it could be small, it could be big, but I think there's always that moment where you're like, is this the time when I run? Or is this the time when I choose to transform this moment and transform myself?
And one of the symbolic themes that you mentioned, coming out of the shadows, represents something bigger. As immigrants, whatever your story is, we're safer coming out. Tell us what that means in the context of the actual podcast and on a macro level for the Latino community, that we're safer coming out and telling our stories.
Yes, I think that if you are an immigrant or have immigrant parents, grandparents, ancestors, I think in my experience, there is a stigma with it, and there's a pressure to assimilate, a pressure to hide who you are, to not speak the language of your immigrant parents. And I will say that typically applies to non-English speaking immigrant. People from the UK, from those places are usually, wow, what a beautiful accent you have, Mr. British man. It's so regal and so sophisticated. But when someone speaks with an Arabic accent or accent from a Latin American country or even Greek or some other, a Slavic accent of some sort, there is a stigma with that, especially in the Western Hemisphere. So that being said, I think for a long time we've been taught to hide our identity and just try to assimilate. And I think that has been a dangerous practice because I think in being invisible, we've been sort of erased from history books. We've sort of been dehumanized and we've only been portrayed as caricatures. And I'm speaking specifically about the Mexican American community in the United States, and just being able to sort of step out of the shadows and reclaim our stories, even if we're scared of the authority figures, has been a way to take back that power. And that is thematically what we talk about in the podcast. I think storytelling is very powerful, as I'm sure you know, Fed, because you're a storyteller. And being able to take back our stories has been really cool. And I do think we're living in a different time when people are going to go on TikTok. They're going to go on social media, and they're going to say what they're feeling, who they are. They're going to stand on their business. It's a whole thing.
So, how do we reclaim our stories in a climate where we all still have responsibilities, but in a reality where we're so aware of everything that's happening, right? We've all become awake and we have to do our best to reclaim. How do we do that while still surviving?
I mean, look, I'm not like a life coach. I don't know how to I don't like to tell people what to do. I think for me, I will speak for myself and say I feel responsibility to my community to reclaim these stories and tell these stories, but I also feel a responsibility to that survival part. Like when I'm interviewing somebody, for example, who's undocumented or going through anything, like my first priority is their humanity and their ability to survive, as you said. And I think that should be everyone's first instinct, right? I think you have to make a choice sometimes as to whether you're afraid of consequences from people in power, as to whether you are going to speak up. And it doesn't always work out well, and there's calculated risk involved. I think, for me, it's been through storytelling. And, in Buddhism, there's something called the human revolution. The idea is if you yourself are transforming your relationship with your environment, it's going to actually help transform the broader environment. And so that's kind of how I see it. So, like, when I am faced with a tough situation that feels like it's huge, to give it a specific example, the immigration camps that were happening in the United States under the Trump administration and continue to happen to some extent under the Biden administration, that feels like like surreal and like I can't do anything about it in one way, but in the other way, I'm like, if I tell my story, if I have my own human revolution, maybe there'll be a ripple effect that helps alleviate the conditions in the world that allowed for that to happen. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I view the world.
Yes, absolutely. I get that. And I wonder, how has your own survival history, because there were times in your life when the question of survival was real for you, right? How has that shaped your storytelling and the work you're doing today?
Yeah, I think it gave me a lot of empathy. I think I've lived a kind of life that sometimes was really hard. I think it gave me a very specific lens to tell stories through, and it gave me a lot of empathy and it gave me a lot of understanding. And hopefully it's made me less reactive. There's like when you're, growing up in a rough neighborhood, here in LA, we had riots in 1992 that were really hard. And sometimes I still think that traumatized me, and I'm still processing and having to go through, losing my home and living in my car and losing jobs and experiencing breakups and heartache and mental problems and all that stuff. And I think in those moments when stuff like that is happening to you, you think like you're never going to survive or it's never going to get better. And it always kind of does. And you always kind of do. And so for me, it's helped me be more conscientious of like when somebody's going through something really bad. Like if somebody's behaving a certain way or experiencing a certain hardship, I have deep empathy for them. But it's also given me almost like a pause button where I don't think I ever had it growing up. Like I grew up very reactive. So somebody's talking shit to me, I'm gonna talk shit back. Somebody wants to hit me, I'm gonna hit them back. And having survived a lot of really shady situations, I think now I have more of a pause button. So if somebody's saying something awful to me, I can pump my brakes and just be like, whoa, what's this about? Is this really about me right now? Is this person going through something? Do I react negative to negative? Or can I like elevate a little and, if somebody's not respecting me, treat them with respect and hopefully that wins the conversation. I don't, yeah, like that's a great question, but I do think that those are some of the ways it shaped me.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're talking about that journey from reacting to responding.
Yeah.
You've been responding through your work.
I think, look, my work is, I will say, like, my work is an example of tracking my own evolution as a storyteller. I think when I first kind of started, I was just sort of chasing, you know, success, for lack of a better word. And then even when I felt like I had achieved what some people would consider success, it didn't feel good. And ultimately, like, whenever I failed, again, I thought it was like the end of the world because I was judging everything I was doing by this idea of a very modern capitalistic view of success. Just like a really fancy way of saying like I was chasing the money. and, and then I had this like sort of rock bottom moment of just being, you know, bankrupt, unhoused, evicted, and realizing what am I going to do? Well, how can I be different? And I realized I had to do everything I was doing, I had to do the opposite. And for me, like going from like the motivation to what I do being money and myself to actually making an impact on the world. And so all my work is mission driven. I want to tell stories about my community. I want to humanize them. I want to bring those stories to a mass audience just to leave the world a little bit better than I found it, And that's kind of shifted not just my perspective, but again, the trajectory of my life. And I love what you said about the difference between reacting and responding. And I do feel like this is my response, to the situation of the cultural and social apartheid of living, in the entertainment capital of the world, where 50% of the people here are of Latino descent, and yet we are erased from mass media by the people in the city who make the mass media.
So it's amazing that now you're on the front lines of creating content and having an opportunity to create impact through your work. That goes all the way back. It started all the way back with your early childhood experiences and growing up. And it's important, I think, to paint a picture for the listeners. What was life in Compton like growing up?
Yeah, the 90s was kind of wild. I grew up in the 90s and yeah, I was primarily in the Compton area. We moved around a lot because my parents were undocumented and we slept on a lot of couches and trailers. My first home was a trailer park in Compton, and it was cool. It was, the thing is, 90% of the time it was beautiful, and 10% of the time shit got real. And I think that's the case for almost any place you live. But it's just in Southeast LA in the 90s, shit getting real meant something very violent. And so I think that there was a lot of turmoil caused by economic recession, a status quo that created a caste system between people of color and the white people, and a growing unrest in the immigrant communities here in Los Angeles and in the Black community here in Los Angeles. So much so that it would erupt in violence almost on the daily. And it was a kind of violence where it was like black on black crime, brown on brown crime, but it was also black on brown crime. Like we had race wars. We obviously had the LA riots, and the LA riots I think represented a microcosm of that. And even though those riots started over, a very specific incident of police brutality on Rodney King and the unfairness of that, the ruling where the police basically got off with a slap on the wrist, I think it turned into a political statement about how the disenfranchised people in LA were fed up with not having any say, any power, any right. And I think that from the tumultuousness of that time period, the LA that we know now, which still has a lot of problems, especially economic disparity. But I do think it's flourished in a way that where there's a lot of the culture that the dominant culture, whether you get to see it on TV or not, in this sprawling metropolis, one of the marquee cities in the world, is created by Black and Brown and Asian and Middle Eastern immigrants. You know, that's what this place is. It is far from a perfect place, but it is kind of a Shangri-La for people of color to express themselves through food, through music, through art, through stories, through culture. And I think that would have not been possible without a lot of the trauma that we had to go through in the 90s. And for me, very specifically, I'm a redheaded Mexican, even redheaded white people have it hard. It's a little bit harder when
you're a minority too.
Yeah, so it was rough for me because, you know, Black and brown people did not fuck with me. The white people didn't fuck with me. The police didn't understand me. And so it was kind of rough, but I think in being sort of a misfit, I think I found my true calling, which is to be sort of the guy who gets to tell stories about misfits.
Yeah. So on that point, being a misfit and not belonging 100% to any group, how have you arrived at your most authentic self?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know,
I know we never get there.
yeah, I feel like it is a constant evolution. I feel like everybody, I don't know. Okay, I feel like for me, there is a base of who I am. And I think sometimes when life gets really hard, I forget that, you know, and I think that's when you react. That's when you're reactive, you know. I think if you can put a pause and instead of reacting, responding, I think when you respond, you're really accessing who am I deep inside, right? Am I really the guy who wants to throw a punch right now? Or am I the guy who wants to de-escalate this? You know, am I the person who like wants to go on social media and just scream at everybody because the world is unfair and unjust? Or am I somebody who's going to feel like, how can I contribute to a better society? And I think like at my core, what I realized was I like kindness and I like to be nice. And fundamentally, I like helping other people. I get joy from other people's joy. And so those three things, even though, like you said, we are always evolving what that means when you take these ingredients and combine them together, I think the constant battle is not letting the outside world change those core principles inside of me. So I have a deep appreciation for these three pillars in me, you know? And so I just try and live by that. And whenever I'm struggling with whether I should do a job or even take a note from an executive or take criticism from somebody I love, I'm always like, if I'm in my best behavior, I'm like, how does this apply to these three things? How do I, you know, find joy in this? How do I find positivity in this? How do I find kindness in this? And yeah, like when I'm at my best, that's who I am. And then when I'm not, it's really about learning how to forgive yourself when you mess up, you know? Because for the longest time, I was one of the hardest people on myself. And so, you know, the idea of failure was terrifying. And because of that, I was afraid to shoot my shot, try, make an effort, make any kind of effort, even to be a better version of myself. And I think nowadays, the fear is still there, but it doesn't cripple me.
But just to recap, the three pillars for you are joy, positivity, and kindness.
Yeah. So for me, it's like, where do I find my joy? For example, So for me, there are things that bring me joy intrinsically. Helping the people I love brings me joy. Humor brings me joy, you know? And I think just understanding that, what are the things that bring me joy? So I think that's the first one. And kindness, I think a little bit different. I think a lot of times people think positivity and kindness go hand in hand. But there are a lot of people who are like positive and secretly they're like assholes. I think kindness is very powerful because, again, it's really easy to react when someone's being toxic to you by being toxic right back. But I think if somebody is being toxic to you and you can respond with kindness, it could be very powerful. And can I recognize that they are probably caught in a circle of their own energies and stuff that's happened in their life, you know? I think specifically when we think about that, like when you're working with people, sometimes you go to a job and you're like, I don't like this job. Or you get cut off in traffic, or there's a line at the metro, you know, like there's all these things that sometimes can be really fucking annoying, to be honest. And then you just in a bad mood. But if in that moment you can just let somebody cut, like sometimes when I'm in traffic and I'm like, I find myself like really angry about traffic, like the way I kind of deal with it is by letting somebody go in front of me and being like, oh, I'm going to be nice to this person. I'm going to do an act of kindness, you know?
And that makes you feel better.
It does. And then suddenly you're like, oh, I feel good. Because I do believe, you know, the laws of thermodynamics, like energy is transferred.
Absolutely.
If you're in a negative space, you're just going to keep being in a negative space. If you can steal a little kindness from like an act of kindness, I think that's very powerful.
It's the most basic currency, human currency, and a little smile just sets the tone for everything.
Yeah, it's gratitude is so powerful. So I think every time, no matter what the situation is, my goal is to go in there with gratitude and be like, hey, I'm grateful to be in this situation. I'm grateful for these people for caring enough to have an opinion, you know, and that doesn't mean I have to agree with everything they say, but it does mean I have to respect everything they say. And the third thing being positivity. And I feel I'm not talking about naivety. Don't be naive, right? If like somebody's shooting a gun, run. Don't be like, hey, I'm going to go talk to this guy.
I'm going to smile. A smile will disarm this.
Yeah. But I do think, you know, they've been telling me the world's going to end since I was a kid, you know? In the 80s and 90s, it was like HIV, you know, Y2K, earthquakes, riots, fires, you know.
We're still here.
And we're still here. And so just knowing, for me, positivity is built on this very simple, basic principle from Lord of the Rings: this too shall pass. This is going to end. Whatever you're going through is going to end. And that helps me in two ways. If something great that I'm going through, something is beautiful and I'm on a high, I know it's going to end. And so it teaches me to appreciate it and be in the moment. Now, if something is hard, really hard, knowing that it's going to end gives me a tremendous sense of relief.
That's awesome.
The pandemic, like I knew it was going to end. I knew somehow it was going to end. I didn't know how, but it was just knowing that it's going to end gave me a tremendous determination to keep going, you know, because it's really easy to just lay down and let the world happen to you, especially when shit is hard.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we could talk for days about the complexities of everything. So we've only scratched the surface. But on that note, anything else you'd like to add as we start to wrap up?
I had a great time chatting with you. You definitely made me think about things I've not ever even paused to think about. So I appreciate the thoughtfulness of your questions and what you're doing with this show, for sure.
Well, thank you, Erick, for being here. And hopefully this is the start of many conversations in the future.
Hell yeah. Thank you, Fed.
And that's today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, have an amazing day. And remember to keep on living time on.